and our first presenter, Dr. Nile Green, has sent in a recording. So Dr. Green is a professor of history at UCLA, or the University of California, Los Angeles, and he holds the Ibn Khaldun Endowed Chair in World History. His major publications include Bombay Islam, The Religious Economy of the West, Indian Ocean, The Love of Strangers, What Six Muslim Students Learned in Jane Austen's London, and most recently, Global Islam, A Very Short Introduction, and How Asia Found Herself, A Story of Intercultural Understanding. Because Dr. Green is presenting by recording, we are sharing his email address for any questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to have questions after his presentation. So you can reach him at Green, Green, @history.ucla.edu. You can please start the recording now.
To meet all of you. Hello there, and good afternoon. It's my very great pleasure to be speaking to you at this conference. And my only regret is that I can't be there in Delhi to meet all of you and hear to your papers as well. So I'll be talking today about a case study, really, of what I've called the linguistic parameters of Indo-Japanese exchange. It's a case study that comes out of a book I recently published called How Asia Found Herself, A Story of Intercultural Understanding. And in the book, I was broadly asking a couple of questions. How Asia found herself, a phrase that I took from a famous speech by Jawaharlal Nehru in 1947. Asia is finding herself again, he said at the famous Asia Relations Conference in Delhi, where you are today. And the questions I was asking in this book were how East and Southeast Asia was interpreted in West and South Asia, and vice versa, which is to say how Japan, China, and Burma, Myanmar today were understood in India and the Middle East. And I was particularly interested in the challenge of language, the challenge of the spread of cultural or indeed historical or even political and economic understanding between these different regions of Asia, which were in a sense divided by not only many different languages and language groups, but of course different scripts and indeed entirely different writing systems. One of the primary questions I began to ask was the term Asia itself. What were its origins? How did it travel across the continent it named? Well, as I'm sure we're all aware, Asia is an ancient Greek name that gradually spread across the continent it designates, initially in the early 1600s through the Jesuit Catholic missionaries to Ming China, and also by Jesuit missionaries to the Mughal Empire. But really its main shift, the introduction of the term and the concept of Asia to the continent itself, spread in the age of print, in the early 19th century in particular. We can see here a couple of important atlases and geographies which were moving, as it were, eastwards from the European origins of that term into, first of all, the Ottoman Empire and then Iran and South Asia. And indeed, that outsider quality of the term Asia, adopted as it was into so many different Asian languages, Asia in Japanese, Asia in various Indian languages, we see that with the name of Japan too. As I traced in this Latin map from the Dutch cartographer Mercator that was used in a very famous printed Ottoman geographical work, the Jahan Nama, the book of the world, the world revealer, I suppose one would say, printed by the pioneering Ottoman printer Ibrahim Mutafarrika. We see here the Jazire Yapuna, the islands of Japan. But what we note here is actually the name for Japan that gets introduced into West Asia, the Middle East, and then into South Asia, including India, of course, is not a version of Japan's own self-designation, Nippon or Nihon, but a version of in fact, the Latin name originally, Japonia, which had appeared in Mercator's map, which becomes here in the Ottoman version, Japonia. And thence into other Middle Eastern or Indian languages, we have versions of that European name, either Japan or Japania in Indian languages such as Hindi or Bengali or Tamil, or Japun or Japun in languages such as Persian and Urdu. But it's really in the late 18th and the early 19th century, the Meiji and Shōwa periods, when we actually start to get more direct connections between Japan and India, specifically through the mercantile trade between Calcutta and particularly Mumbai and the port cities, the treaty ports of Japan, such as Kobe and Yokohama. Following on the work of Claude Markowitz on Indian merchants in Japan, in my earlier book, Terrains of Exchange, I looked at the Indian merchants who were responsible for, among other things, the creation of the first mosque in Japan, which still survives to this day in Kobe. And it's this port city geography that spreads commercial exchange and commercial connections with Japan, whether with the European shipping lines or the Nippon Yusen Kaisha shipping line, which directly connects between Yokohama and Bombay from 1885. There were, of course, a whole series of joint commercial projects that developed the export of Indian textiles and the exports of Japanese matchboxes with designs catering to the Indian and Middle Eastern marketplaces, as we can see in these matchboxes here. But it's text that I want to speak about today, and the transmission of written public knowledge, printed knowledge of Japan in Indian languages. The earliest text I was able to find was a translation of Lawrence Oliphant's account, which was translated and published by the great Hindu publisher Munshi Nawal Kishore of Lucknow in 1867 under the title Tarikh-i China Japan, the history of China and Japan. But we also have translations coming not only from English texts, but also translations coming from Arabic texts, such as the Urdu translation published in Lahore in 1908, of actually a text that only appeared a few months earlier in Cairo, an Arabic Safarnama of Japan, an Arabic travelogue about Japan, describing eyewitness conditions seen by the Egyptian journalist Ali Ahmed Jerjawi. It's also from this port city geography I mentioned a moment ago that we start to see overlaps between trade connections and the publishing of accounts of Japan. There are two famous Persian newspapers that operate out of Calcutta, Habl al-Matin and Azad. And we know that these actually had not only accounts of Japan, largely taken from sources such as the London newspapers, the Times of London or the Illustrated London News, which were available then to the editors of these Persian newspapers. We also know that the newspapers in turn circulated out to Japan. And indeed, I found one travelogue from the early 1900s, which described a group of Indian students reading the Habl al-Matin while they were in Japan, with its calls for modernization of Iran and indeed India. In Bombay, there was a very interesting text that I talk about in my book, the mirror of the time through the history of China, Greater China and Japan, which was published by a famous exiled Iranian publisher in 1893. And this account, in fact, combined the much earlier account of China by Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit missionary to China, and a somewhat later mid-19th century English account of Japan. And here we can see from that text that we actually see there an image on the right using the lithographic technology then that was available. And there was the mainstay of Indian language publishing in the latter part of the 19th century. We see there and the image, the Padshah Halie Qin, the current emperor of China, and the Padshah Halie Japan, the current emperor of Japan. But of course, by this time, these were actually not quite contemporary images at all by the later 1890s, when of course we were well into the Meiji period of reforms. But it was in India, as in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and many other regions of the continent. It was in 1905, in the wake of the Japanese defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, that the real explosion of interest in a range of Indian languages takes place. We see a series of texts written in Urdu, some of them truly dramatic, such as the one I illustrate here, Zafar Ali Khan's play, his early Urdu drama, The War of Russia and Japan. And we see here, Tisra Act, Pehla Scene, third act, of course, first scene. There are also poetic works, such as the other ones I've listed here on the page, that were again published just as the war was going on, or indeed at with the defeat of Imperial Russia. We also have other texts that were inspired by various Indian nationalist Muslim freedom fighters, as it were, of the pen, if not more actively, such as Khadim Hussein's Mikado-nama, the Book of the Mikado, the Book of the Japanese Emperor, written or published in 1907 and written in Urdu. And we can see there on the right the lithographic illustration, the Shahanshah Japan, the more modernized, more up-to-date image of the Emperor of Japan there in that lithographic image. And here another text, this time in Persian, but published from Calcutta in 1907, another Mikado-nama, another poetic, heroic account of the Japanese victories here, with images we can see here with on the bottom right, Bose written, of course, a Bengali name, the name of the Bengali illustrator. But I managed to determine that the source of this image was actually an image by Wilhelm Koekkoek, a Dutch war correspondent and illustrator who worked for the Illustrated London News, where this image was taken along with the news reports to furnish the inspiration then for poets such as Hussein Ali Shirazi, who, as far as we know, didn't actually visit Japan himself. And again, we see Hermanus Wilhelm Koekkoek's illustrations again in the Mikado-nama published in Calcutta in 1907. Well, speaking of Calcutta, of course, we know famously of Rabindranath Tagore's meetings with Japanese intellectuals in Calcutta, most famously Okakura Kazuko, and then his eventual journey to Japan in 1916, leading to his 1919 Japanese work, Japanyatri in Bengali. But still, even though we're now reaching a time when we have not only trade connections with Japan, which weren't producing texts, or texts about Japan, which were either based on translations of other languages, or indeed on inspiration from European news reports. Now we do indeed have intellectuals and literary figures, great poets such as Tagore, going themselves to Japan. But the barrier of language still remains, as a number of Indian and Japanese scholars have established through their work on Tagore. Tagore's lectures were given in Japan in English, and the translations of his poetry as well as his speeches into Japanese were made via English, not directly from Bengali into Japanese. Still, Tagore was determined to promote the study of the Japanese language in India and recruited Sano Jinosuke, to teach at Shantiniketan in 1905. And this has been studied then by a number of scholars. But Jinosuke, unfortunately, only stayed for a number of months at Shantiniketan, taught a small number of 12 to 13-year-olds how to read basic katakana, but wasn't able to stay and be employed and find enough students there at Shantiniketan to actually develop then the beginnings of Indian studies of the Japanese language, and particularly, of course, of the written language. Because, of course, across Asia, there was not only the challenge of learning to speak other languages, but the much more difficult challenge, of course, of learning the different scripts and indeed learning to translate directly between different Asian languages with their different scripts as well. I did in my research trying to find a number of phrase books, including this fascinating Gujarati Japanese phrase book. There are a number of such Japanese phrase books in Indian languages. Most of them were, as you can see here, just via translating, as it were, pronunciation. So we'll see here that you see an English word in the middle with the Gujarati translation and Gujarati transcription, the vocalization, if you like, of the Japanese word there, either side here on the word lists organized by category. This was pretty much the common method then for such phrase books. Very, very useful for learning to speak speak Japanese, or at least basic Japanese phrases, if not fully grammar, but of course not of any use for reading the language. But nonetheless, Dinsho Vanya's text was very unusual in also providing the rudiments of actually understanding Japanese script, Japanese writing. But of course, as we all know, there are three types of writing systems in Japanese. And of course, characters per se were the most challenging that weren't a feature of Dinsho's or any other book I was able to find. But we do have this fascinating institution found in Japan in 1897, the Tokyo Gaikugo Gakko, the School of Foreign Languages. And it was there in 1930 that a graduate of Aligarh Muslim University, a very educated man, an Indian patriot, an Indian nationalist, Badruddin Fazli, who went to teach Urdu and Persian at the school. And he wrote a fascinating text, 2 volumes, around 400 pages in Urdu, that as far as I've been able to establish was the most detailed, first-hand, direct account of Japan written in any Indian language by this time. It comprised 1 volume of a travelogue of its author's own experiences, and the other volume detailing the history, the literature, the arts, the newspapers, the intellectual scene, the economy, just about everything one would like to know about Japan. But unfortunately for Fazli, he was involved in what I've called an asymmetrical exchange, an asymmetrical linguistic exchange. He had to teach, or he was employed to teach, as I mentioned, Urdu and Persian to his Japanese students under the charge of Professor Gamorechi, the professor of Urdu and of Persian at the language school. But he wasn't allowed to try to speak Japanese to either his students or his employer, Professor Gamo. Subsequently then, although Fazli writes this extraordinary, as I mentioned, 2-volume book, The Haqiqat Japan, the truth about Japan, or the reality of Japan, that includes fascinating photographs and all manner of subjects and a great deal of astute analysis, really, of Japanese life. Nonetheless, as far as I was able to glean from his working conditions, from his own account, his 200-page travelogue, and indeed from such clues as the vocabulary list that's given in the back of the text, but again given just in terms of the transliteration of a traveler's vocabulary, one might say. time travel here, guiding on kind of cars or vehicles, etc., numbers, that he didn't actually manage to learn at least to read Japanese. And indeed, the bibliography at the end of his book were entirely on Indian language works and a couple of earlier Urdu works. The Japanese works that he did cite in his bibliography were translated into English. And yet, in 1936, by which time Fazli had returned to India and been replaced, these are 2-year contracts at the school, with a follow-up teacher, Mr. Balas, a fascinating special issue, the Japan number of the Delhi literary journal, Saqi, after of course, the wine-bringing figure of classical Persian and Urdu poetry. This special issue was published, which had accounts of Japan written in Urdu, written by Indian authors, but also extraordinarily written by a number of Japanese as well. These were students of Fazli, and indeed by Professor Gamorechi himself. And what we can see here is, again, the outcomes of this asymmetric exchange, that because of having, as an independent country, Japan had its own, admittedly, imperial language school, the Tokyo Gakugo Gakko, India itself didn't have such. The closest thing was, of course, in the imperial capital of London, as what was then the School of Oriental Studies, as was then founded in the 1900s. Subsequently, we have here first-hand accounts written in Urdu by Japanese, but not as far as I was able to establish. And I hope your conference might find actual examples of direct writings in Japanese by Indian scholars. And so to conclude then, we do find after 1905, and particularly then coinciding as the Indian independence movements gathered steam over the following decades, this Japanophilia, this fascination with Japan, and particularly the rise, independence, modernization of Japan, summed up, of course, in the defeat of Imperial Russia. There was an emphasis, though, on many accounts on military knowledge, and indeed upon the emperor of Japan. But nonetheless, this Japanophilia was much harder to translate, so to speak, into a Japanology, particularly under the conditions of imperial and colonial India itself. The challenge of building Japanology, then, that's to say, of a linguistically robust accounts in Indian languages of Japan that were based on reading written Japanese, then, meant that, at least in the texts I was able to find, there was mostly mediated information from pivot languages such as English, and the lack of linguistic expertise or institutions, despite the efforts, of course, of Tagore to institute Japanese language teachings in Shantiniketan. Subsequently, I wasn't able to find, even though Fazli himself translated a famous Japanese novel into Urdu in the later 1930s, I wasn't able to find direct translations from Japanese into Indian languages. Nonetheless, I hope at this marvelous conference, other scholars will have found such. I'll be very happy to learn from you. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.